It is said that the desert remembers everything. Not in the way a diary remembers, with neat lines and tidy dates, but in the way an old man remembers, scattered details, half-whispered truths, and a tendency to embellish the most interesting parts. If this is true, then somewhere in the desert's memory lies a story about a group of monks who walked into the sands one day and never came back. There is no single account of their disappearance, which is both infuriating for historians and delicious for storytellers. Some say they simply moved on, leaving their stone monastery behind like an old pair of sandals. Others insist they ascended bodily into the heavens, robes and all, because the desert apparently has good taste in drama. Then there are the more skeptical types who believe they were buried alive in a sandstorm, which is not so much divine as it is uncomfortably practical. What we know, and this is the part you can put in ink without historians arguing too violently, is that these monks existed. For centuries they thrived in one of the most inhospitable corners of the known world, surviving where caravans perished, fasting where kings feasted, and meditating while the rest of humanity busied itself with wars, taxes, and inventing new ways to make bread. The first mention of them appears in a travel diary from around the 5th century, written by a merchant who was, by all accounts, terrible at spelling, but excellent at noticing the unusual. He describes a stone hive in the desert, occupied by men of the sun, who wore garments bleached white by sand and time. They spoke little, offered guests a drink that tasted like boiled cactus, generously labeled tea, and spent most of their days in prayer, silence, or staring at the horizon as if waiting for it to answer back. No one knew exactly where they came from. Some claimed they were exiles from a faraway kingdom, punished for refusing to bow to the wrong god. Others believed they were descendants of an older priesthood, keepers of a spiritual lineage that predated the rise of cities. The monks themselves never confirmed or denied anything. They simply smiled, that infuriating, serene smile, and offered more cactus tea. The desert has always attracted such people. There's something about endless horizons and the absence of human chatter that draws in those who want to hear only the wind, or perhaps the voice of God. But unlike solitary hermits who lived in caves gnawed out by time, this group lived together in a kind of disciplined, sand-swept brotherhood. They had gardens, if you can call 2 fig trees, and a stubborn patch of herbs a garden. They baked bread in sun-heated clay ovens, and they had an aqueduct system that made passing engineers scratch their heads and mutter, "How?" It was a life that looked from the outside like voluntary exile, but for them it was the opposite, a deliberate stepping into the heart of things. The silence was not absence but presence. The stillness was not lifelessness but a deeper kind of motion. And perhaps, if you believe the rumors, they found something in that silence that the rest of the world has been too busy to notice. The trouble with being mysterious, however, is that people start inventing reasons for you. Over the centuries, the monks became the subject of both reverence and suspicion. Pilgrims trekked for days to see them, hoping for blessings or wisdom, and left with nothing more than a parable they couldn't quite understand. Nomadic tribes respected their space, mostly though there are tales of the monks waking up to find their fig trees missing. Rulers occasionally sent envoys to investigate, but they rarely got more than polite nods and a firm refusal to pay taxes. Then, one day, they were gone. No grand announcement, no farewell procession, just gone. The first signs were small. A passing caravan noted the gates open, but no one inside. A merchant from the coast reported that the oven was still warm but the bread inside had burned to black. A herder, passing by at dawn, claimed he saw a long trail of footprints leading away from the monastery, not toward any known oasis or settlement, but deeper into the shifting dunes. Search parties went out, some armed with water skins and ropes, others with more superstitious tools like charms and bells to ward off desert spirits. None of them found the monks. None of them even found the footprints. The desert, as it does, rearranged itself, erasing paths, swallowing traces, and making sure that whatever had happened remained stubbornly unhelpful to anyone who wanted closure. In the absence of facts, stories multiplied. Some claimed the monks had been abducted by a rival religious order, though no one could explain how you move that many men across miles of desert without leaving evidence. Others said they had all decided, unanimously, to walk into the horizon as an act of final devotion. A few more dramatic tellers insisted the sky itself had opened, and the monks had ascended in a pillar of light. One chronicler, possibly after too much cactus tea, suggested they had simply turned into sand. Whatever the truth, the monastery stood empty. The walls weathered under wind and sun, the aqueduct cracked, and the fig trees eventually gave up. By the time later travelers came looking, The place had already begun its slow transformation from living community to ruin. And so the desert kept their secret. The secret of the monks who vanished, locked away beneath its dunes, filed somewhere between lost cities and treasures that turn out to be a pile of rocks. Before the monks disappeared into whatever corner of the universe or the sand they chose, they had to appear in the first place. That part of the story, the origins, is, predictably, almost as murky as their ending. The earliest suggestion of their existence comes from a fragment of a letter found in a crumbling monastery far from the desert on the fringes of what used to be the Byzantine Empire. It is written in a careful but oddly nervous hand, as if the writer feared the parchment might burst into flames if he said too much. The letter speaks of a band of brothers who had gone out to the edge of the map to keep the old light alive. That's it. No names, no coordinates. Just the edge of the map, which, in those days, could mean anywhere beyond the next hill. If you line up the scraps of information, bits of scripture, half-remembered oral traditions, and one slightly eccentric Greek historian who had a fondness for making things up, you get the impression that these monks were the survivors of something. Not survivors in the sense of barely escaped a shipwreck, but in the sense of we don't fit in anywhere else, and we're not changing. The prevailing theory is that they belong to a splinter group of a much older spiritual tradition, the kind of tradition that didn't care much for the new religious fashions sweeping the ancient world, where most faiths were in the business of converting or conquering. These people seemed content to withdraw, guarding what they believed was the unbroken way. Of course, that phrase could mean anything: a set of rituals, a philosophy, or simply a stubborn refusal to switch from barley bread to wheat. Legends paint them as the heirs to a priesthood older than Rome, older than Babylon, possibly older than written language. This, historians will tell you, is both fascinating and irritating. Fascinating because, if true, it places them as custodians of a worldview that predated civilization. Irritating because legends have a habit of claiming everyone is older than civilization, even tribes that archaeologists can date back to last Tuesday. What seems more plausible is that the monks were descendants, spiritual if not literal, of a network of desert hermits who had been living in scattered caves and stone cells for centuries. Over time, these solitary seekers began to band together, pooling resources, sharing water, and developing a kind of desert city-state, only without the city part. A community without walls, as one scribe poetically put it, which is odd, considering they literally built walls around their monastery later. Their choice of location remains a mystery. The desert they chose was not just dry, it was vindictive. Sandstorms could strip paint off a wall in an afternoon, and temperatures swung from frozen camel at night to oven-baked pilgrim by day. Yet here they were, digging aqueducts, coaxing figs from stubborn soil, and building stone corridors that could outlast most royal palaces. One theory is that they chose this location precisely because it was so awful. After all, the harder it was to get there, the fewer casual visitors would show up to interrupt their meditations. Another theory, less cynical but more romantic, is that they believed the desert itself was a kind of living temple, a place where the veil between the human and the divine was thinner. This would explain why so many of their surviving symbols involved the sun, the horizon, and endless spirals of sand. The monks were not completely cut off from the world. Traders passed through, sometimes deliberately, sometimes after getting horribly lost. In exchange for food or guidance to the nearest oasis, the monks would offer simple gifts: hand-woven cloth, clay jars of desert honey, and occasionally a small, carefully inscribed tablet covered in symbols that no outsider could read. Some of these tablets have survived, though modern scholars can't agree on whether they are sacred texts, coded recipes, or very elaborate grocery lists. Descriptions of the monks themselves vary wildly. Some sources describe them as tall and gaunt, with sun-bleached beards and eyes that seem to look straight through you. Others describe them as plump, cheerful men who laughed easily and told jokes at their own expense. This could mean the order had different types of personalities, or it could mean that travelers have never been very good at consistent descriptions. Their clothing was practical but symbolic, loose robes dyed with the faint colors of local plants, and wide hoods that kept the sun from baking their skulls. The hoods also had the convenient side effect of making them look like mysterious holy men, even when they were just out repairing a wall. Jewelry was rare, but when it appeared, it was always in the form of a single sun-shaped pendant worn over the heart. Despite the apparent austerity of their lives, there are hints that the monks had an unexpected sense of humor. One account tells of a caravan leader who stumbled into their settlement half dead from thirst. The monks revived him, fed him, and after 3 days, handed him a water skin for the road. When he opened it later, he found it was full of sand. Attached was a note: Sometimes what you think you need is not what you need. Scholars debate whether this was profound spiritual teaching or just a desert prank. By the time the monks became known to the wider world, they already seemed ancient. Their ways were unchanged, their buildings weathered but sturdy, and their traditions carried out with the kind of casual precision that comes from centuries of repetition. And yet, somewhere in their story, hidden in the cracks between what was written and what was whispered, was the seed of their vanishing. If you ask anyone who has actually lived in the desert, not just visited for a week in an ill-advised camel-riding holiday, they'll tell you the same thing. The desert is a merciless teacher. It strips away everything that isn't essential, and if you refuse to learn, it kills you. The monks seem to have accepted this as part of the tuition. Their settlement was not merely in the desert. It was in a part of the desert that appeared to be actively hostile to the concept of life. The wind wasn't just dry, it was abrasive. The sand wasn't the soft, cinematic kind you see in adventure films. It was sharp, fine as powder, and it got into absolutely everything. There are stories of monks carefully sealing jars of preserved dates only to find sand in them months later, as if the desert had politely let itself in for a snack. But to the monks, these weren't inconveniences, they were lessons. Every grain of sand was a reminder of impermanence, every sunrise a lecture on endurance, and every blistered foot a kind of exam they were proud to pass. The desert did not allow for vanity. Haircuts were rare, mirrors almost non-existent, and the closest thing to luxury was having a robe without too many holes chewed in it by wind or rodents. Daily life was built around the extremes of the environment. Before dawn, the monks would rise, not because they were eager to greet the day, but because the window between cool enough to function and so hot you hallucinate a conversation with a cactus was very short. They'd begin with silent meditation, seated in the open, facing the horizon. Some accounts claim they kept their eyes open, letting the slow light of sunrise burn into them, not in a mystical sense but as a practical way to train themselves to see in the blinding daytime glare. After meditation came the work, and work in the desert was always a negotiation with the elements. Some were assigned to the gardens, which was an optimistic term for a few stubborn rows of plants coaxed into life by underground irrigation channels. Others tended to the goats and camels, creatures that seemed to share the monks' stoic attitude toward existence. And then there were the water-bearers, the most respected among them, not because of any ceremonial prestige, but because they had the critical task of keeping everyone alive. Their food was simple: dates, flatbread, goat's milk, and the occasional handful of wild herbs. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals or emergencies. Strangely enough, they did make wine, not the lush, aromatic kind you'd find in fertile valleys, but a sharp, almost medicinal drink that could make even the most devout monk admit that maybe God had invented grapes for other purposes. The desert taught them thrift in ways that would make even the stingiest merchant proud. Every scrap of cloth was reused until it was more patch than original fabric. Broken tools were repaired with whatever could be scavenged. Even water used for washing was collected, filtered through sand and charcoal, and given a second life in the garden. Modern environmentalists would have applauded them if they could have survived the journey out there. But perhaps the greatest lesson the desert offered was silence. In the still hours between windstorms, there was a quiet so complete it became almost tangible. Travelers spoke of being unnerved by it, as if the silence itself were listening. For the monks, this was the desert's true gift. In the absence of noise, one's own thoughts became deafening, and over time easier to live with. There are hints in rare written fragments that the monks saw the desert as a living being, not a god in the conventional sense, but an entity with moods, wisdom, and a peculiar sense of humor. They would speak of listening to the sand, a phrase that outsiders took literally at first, until they realized it was shorthand for paying attention to subtle changes, the shift of wind, the smell of approaching rain, the faint tremor of hooves miles away. Still, for all their reverence toward the land, they didn't romanticize it. The desert could and did kill the unprepared, and even the prepared weren't guaranteed safety. One year, a sandstorm lasted 7 days straight, stripping the paint off their monastery doors and burying their outer wall in drifts taller than a man. After it passed, they dug themselves out, checked the water stores, and returned to work without complaint. In that resilience lay their identity. The desert, with its endless horizon and brutal simplicity, mirrored their own spiritual philosophy. Everything unnecessary must be stripped away, until only what matters remains. And perhaps, though no one wrote it down, this was the beginning of the thought that would one day carry them into vanishing. If survival was simply a matter of stripping away what wasn't essential, what happened when they decided that even their own presence in the world was unnecessary? It is of course impossible to know if they thought in those terms. But when you walk through the remains of their settlement today, stone walls bleached pale, empty courtyards open to the sky, it feels as though the desert kept teaching long after the monks were gone. For as long as they had been out there, the monks of the desert had attracted stories. Not just the usual, their odd but harmless kind of stories, but the sort of rumors that make even skeptical merchants lean in across the fire and lower their voices. The earliest travelers to their settlement claimed to have seen the impossible. A caravan leader once swore that a monk touched a cracked water jar, and the fissure sealed itself. A shepherd insisted that during a drought, the monastery's goats stayed fat and glossy, while his own herd resembled a row of skeletal umbrellas. Nobody could explain how crops continued to grow when the nearest river was a memory, and the nearest rain cloud was probably in another century. It didn't help that the monks themselves refused to comment on any of this. If asked directly, they would either smile faintly or change the subject to something deeply unhelpful, like the importance of sweeping sand out of storage rooms twice a day. Silence, they seemed to believe, was the best fertilizer for rumors. One of the most persistent tales involved their wells. These were deep stone-lined shafts that seemed to draw water from nowhere. Geologists who later examined them noted that the water level was far too high for such an arid region. Locals were convinced the monks had tapped into a hidden river, one that ran beneath the desert like a buried vein. Some, with a flair for drama, claimed it wasn't water at all but some kind of liquid light that only appeared as water to the uninitiated. It's worth noting that these were often the same people who had sampled the monastery's wine before making such statements. Then there were the lights. Desert nights are naturally full of strange glows, moonlight on dunes, heat shimmer from cooling sand, the occasional meteor slicing the sky. But travelers swore the monastery had its own light. They spoke of golden orbs hovering above the rooftops, of pillars of fire that didn't burn anything, of a faint green glow leaking from the cracks in the walls during midnight prayers. A certain tax collector, a profession not generally known for poetic imagination, recorded in his ledger that while he waited to meet the abbot, a radiance like dawn filled the courtyard, though the sun had already set hours before. Being a tax collector, he still charged them the full amount, miracles or not. The monks' relationship with animals also fed into the legend mill. Camels that belonged to visiting traders would kneel without being commanded. Wild birds would land in the courtyards and remain there, unbothered by human presence. There's even a story of a desert fox padding into the kitchen, calmly sitting while a monk fed it scraps, and then trotting away with what could only be described as polite satisfaction. Of course, the desert has its own explanations for all this. The shifting sands can reveal underground springs without warning. Heat and exhaustion can produce visions that feel more real than reality. And as for the animal behavior, well, it's amazing what you can achieve with a few dates and a steady hand. But even the most pragmatic visitors admitted that there was something about the place. Perhaps the most unnerving account came from a soldier stationed in a nearby garrison. He claimed that during a skirmish with raiders, several monks walked into the fray, unarmed, chanting in low, steady voices. The fighting stopped, not because the monks had intervened physically, but because every man present suddenly froze, as if they'd forgotten what they were doing. The soldiers remembered the incident differently than the raiders, but both sides agreed on one detail. The monks simply turned and walked back to the monastery, the wind swallowing their voices as they went. It's important to say that the monks never called these events miracles. In their sparse writings, they avoided any language that suggested divine intervention. They described everything in practical terms. The well was deep, the crops were well tended, the animals were unafraid. If pressed, they'd insist that the desert itself provided, and they simply knew how to listen. But absence of confirmation isn't the same as denial, and so the stories multiplied. Some saw the monks as saints. Others, particularly rival sects, muttered about sorcery. Still others decided they were harmless lunatics with a knack for survival. What made the miracles so enduring in memory was their casualness. There were no grand displays, no declarations of power. If something extraordinary happened, it happened without fanfare, as if the monks barely noticed, and perhaps that was the secret, that whatever they knew so well it had become ordinary to them. It was this atmosphere, quiet, strange, and vaguely unsettling, that made the events leading up to their disappearance all the more jarring. Because if you had asked anyone in those days, they would have said the monks were eternal, as much a part of the desert as the wind or the sand. The idea that they could simply vanish was as unthinkable as the idea that the sun might decide not to rise. And yet, as history has repeatedly shown, the unthinkable doesn't consult anyone before arriving. For decades, the desert monks had existed as a rumor with a roof, fascinating enough to talk about over a campfire, but far too remote to warrant actual visits unless you were unusually curious, unusually devout, or unusually lost. That began to change when merchants started realizing the monastery could be a very convenient halfway point for caravans crossing the more treacherous trade routes. The monks, in their endless capacity for polite hospitality, never turned anyone away. It didn't matter if you were a silk trader from the east, a spice merchant from the coast, or a wandering shepherd who had somehow misplaced his entire flock. There would be food, water, and a bed made of woven mats. The only cost, and this was more a matter of inevitability than policy, was that you'd leave with a story. The first serious wave of outsiders were exactly what you'd expect. Traders, mercenaries, and the occasional diplomatic envoy trying to impress a foreign ruler with tales of his daring desert travel. They arrived with skepticism and left with something between admiration and irritation, because no matter how much they probed, the monks refused to share the one thing visitors wanted most, the source of their water. As far as anyone could tell, the wells had no limit. Even in the worst drought, the monastery was an oasis, a fact that made nearby rulers deeply suspicious. If you were a desert lord who could barely keep your own wells from turning into sand pits, the idea that a group of quiet, sandal-wearing men had cracked the problem of endless fresh water was infuriating. Inevitably, word spread further. Pilgrims began to arrive, sometimes traveling for months just to see if the rumors were true. They came in all shapes and conditions. Weather-beaten mystics convinced the monks held the key to enlightenment, well-dressed aristocrats looking for exotic adventure, and desperate peasants hoping for a miracle to heal a sick child or fix a failed harvest. The monks didn't promise anything. In fact, they had a remarkable talent for making visitors forget what they'd come for in the first place. A pilgrim might arrive demanding to know the meaning of life, but after a week of sweeping courtyards and drinking endless cups of weak tea, he'd leave with the strong conviction that he needed to fix his roof before winter. Not all visitors were friendly. Alongside the pilgrims came opportunists, men who thought they could pry the monastery's secrets loose through bribery, intimidation, or outright theft. These encounters never went as planned. A group of armed thieves once scaled the walls under cover of night, only to find themselves inexplicably walking back out the gates at dawn, empty-handed and unable to explain why they hadn't taken anything. One swore he had seen a figure standing in the courtyard that looked like all of us and none of us, which is the kind of statement that makes you wish he'd just said ghost and been done with it. Then there were the emissaries of various kings, sultans, and warlords. These visits were an exercise in mutual bafflement. The emissaries arrived in glittering caravans, expecting negotiation, only to be greeted by a man in plain robes who offered them bread and suggested they sit in the shade for a while. The monks seemed immune to the grandeur of royal authority, not hostile, just entirely uninterested. A ruler could command 1,000 men, but in the monastery the only authority was the schedule of the bells. This indifference was both disarming and, to some, infuriating. Power hates a mystery it cannot control, and the monks were a walking, chanting, sandal-wearing mystery. Reports began circulating in court circles about unusual activities in the desert. Code, of course, for we have no idea what they're doing and we don't like it. Religious authorities were equally perplexed. Some hailed the monks as holy men preserving ancient wisdom. Others accused them of heresy, pointing out that their practices didn't quite align with the sanctioned liturgy. They prayed, yes, but often in silence, and sometimes facing directions that baffled even the most geographically skilled theologians. Their festivals seemed to mix rituals from several traditions, as though they'd been collecting religious practices like seashells and arranging them in whatever pattern pleased them most. The attention wasn't entirely bad. The influx of visitors brought gifts, fine textiles, exotic fruits, spices, and even books, which the monks copied meticulously into their growing library. In return, they gave out small, seemingly useless items, a carved bead, a scrap of parchment with a single word, a polished stone. Visitors often dismissed these as trinkets, only to later swear the items brought them luck or led to some moment of life-changing clarity. Still, with every new arrival, the monastery's legend grew, and so did the scrutiny. The desert was not just sand and wind. It was a network of rumors, and word traveled fast. Before long, the monks were no longer an isolated community. They were a subject of interest in places far beyond the reach of the dunes. It was this growing awareness that set the stage for the tension to come. Because when enough people start wondering what you're hiding, someone eventually decides they have the right to find out. It's a universal rule of human curiosity. The moment something seems inaccessible, people suddenly feel entitled to it. The desert monks had lived in relative peace for decades, maybe centuries, depending on whose calendar you believed. But the more stories spread about their miraculous water, strange rituals and refusal to answer straight questions, the more pressure began to mount. At first, the attention was manageable. A few nosy traders, some wide-eyed pilgrims, the occasional petty thief who underestimated the challenge of robbing men who seemed to sleep with one eye open. But then came the formal envoys, not the polite ones bringing gifts, but the kind sent when a ruler wanted something and was willing to be patient only up to a point. In the cities, the rumors about the monastery's wealth had taken on the tone of drunken tavern truths. One version claimed the monks had a vault filled with gold, taken as donations from rulers desperate for their blessings. Another insisted they guarded a crystal relic that could summon rain on command. My personal favorite was the claim that they had discovered the original language of humanity and used it to speak with the desert itself. All of these were completely unverified, of course. But since when has that ever stopped anyone? The problem with rumors is that they're like sand in the wind. They travel far, they accumulate in odd places, and eventually they start piling up into dunes that block your door. For the monks, the dune took the form of an increasing number of armed visitors who weren't there for enlightenment. They were there for answers, preferably ones that could be carried off in a saddlebag. It didn't help that the monks' refusal to engage in politics made them suspicious by default. If a ruler asked for allegiance, they gave none. If asked for tribute, they offered only a basket of dates and a smile. If pressed for strategic military aid, a well-placed fortress in the middle of the desert could be useful. They shrugged and said the desert was not for fighting over. This neutrality was admirable in theory, but in practice it made them look like they were hiding allegiances from everyone. And in the volatile chessboard of desert politics, hiding is just another word for enemy. The first real sign of trouble came when a caravan arrived bearing not traders or pilgrims, but a squad of soldiers in royal livery. Officially, they were there to deliver a message. Unofficially, they were there to inspect the monastery for contraband and verify the monks' activities. The inspection found nothing, unless you count 30 jars of pickled vegetables and an alarming number of goat hair blankets as contraband. But the tone had shifted. The monks had moved from being an odd curiosity to a potential threat in the minds of people who mattered. Meanwhile, the religious establishment outside the desert began to sharpen its claws. The monks' mixing of rituals from multiple traditions was seen less as charmingly eclectic and more as dangerously syncretic, which is a polite way of saying you're doing religion wrong and we don't like it. Traveling preachers began warning their congregations that the monks were practicing the old ways, and in some circles the old ways was synonymous with witchcraft. The monks, for their part, didn't seem to notice or pretended not to. They continued their quiet routines, dawn prayers, communal meals, repairs to the ancient walls, tending to their stubbornly green garden. But there were signs, subtle ones, that they understood the situation was changing. For one, they began limiting the number of visitors allowed inside the monastery at any given time. No more sprawling guest houses full of travelers. Now only a handful of outsiders were admitted, and only if they agreed to stay for a set period. Those who left were discouraged from returning too soon. They also became more guarded in conversation. Where once a visiting merchant might be treated to long discussions about the stars, the seasons, or the nature of silence, now there were polite but firm changes of subject. If someone asked about their water supply, the answer was a vague "the desert provides." If someone hinted about hidden wealth, the response was usually a laugh, though not always a warm one. Whispers began to circulate among the traders that the monks were preparing for something. Some said they were fortifying the monastery against attack. Others claimed they were building underground chambers for storage or shelter. A particularly wild rumor suggested they were planning to abandon the monastery entirely, leaving it as suddenly as they had arrived centuries earlier. The tension was palpable, even to the occasional traveler who stumbled into their courtyard without knowing any of the politics. The air felt heavy, the kind of heavy that precedes a storm. Only here, in the endless arid silence, a storm didn't mean rain. It meant people. People with weapons, grievances, and a long list of things they believed the monks owed them. The final straw, though no one realized it at the time, came when a delegation of 3 rival rulers arrived simultaneously. Each believed they had secured an exclusive meeting with the monastery's leader. What followed was part diplomatic debacle, part comedy of errors, and part very awkward tea ceremony. When the 3 rulers realized they were not the only ones invited, the atmosphere soured. Accusations flew, tempers flared, and by the time they left, the sand outside the monastery was littered with the impressions of pacing feet and clenched fists. After that day, it was clear to everyone, including the monks, that something had to give. And in the desert, when something gives, it rarely does so quietly. If the desert monks knew they were about to step off the stage of history, they gave no sign of it. In fact, the whole thing began like any other year with the announcement of the Festival of the Long Dawn, a tradition older than most of the cities whose rulers now wanted them gone. It was supposedly a celebration of the first sunrise after the Great Crossing, some ancient migration that no one alive could explain in full, but which everyone agreed was important enough to commemorate with music, food, and staying awake far longer than was sensible. By the time the date arrived, the rumors had done their usual work. The festival was no longer just a monkish gathering in the middle of nowhere. It was an event people traveled weeks to attend. Pilgrims, traders, spice sellers, wandering storytellers, camel herders, and opportunists of every variety began to fill the narrow track leading to the monastery. From above, the line of travelers must have looked like a scar of movement across the otherwise motionless desert. The monks did not advertise themselves as entertainers, but they understood the value of spectacle. On the morning of the festival, the heavy wooden gates, normally kept closed except for the small visitor's door, were swung wide. Bright banners in deep red and ochre hung from the outer walls, their edges catching the wind like lazy flames. Incense smoke curled into the air, carrying with it a scent somewhere between frankincense and something you could never quite identify. Inside, the courtyard had been transformed. Carpets were laid over the dusty ground, lanterns strung from one wall to another, and a long low table was set up along the shaded side, heavy with bowls of dates, flatbreads, almonds, and dishes that shimmered with oil in the sunlight. A tall ceramic jug sat at the center, the infamous desert wine, brewed from fermented fruits and herbs that made the uninitiated either euphoric or confused, depending on their constitution. The music began just after sunset. No one ever forgot the way it started. A single flute, its sound thin but carrying, played from somewhere high up on the wall. It was joined by a slow, deep drum beat, then another, and then the low hum of voices. These were not the simple chants of piety most expected. The melodies twisted and turned in unexpected intervals, sliding between joy and sorrow in the space of a few notes. Outsiders often described it as beautiful but unsettling, which, given the monks' general aesthetic, seemed to be the point. Visitors were welcome at least for this night, to wander freely inside the outer sections of the monastery. They peered into workshops where monks carved intricate geometric designs into wood, or pounded dried herbs into powder. Some stumbled across alcoves filled with manuscripts in a half-dozen different scripts, their pages illuminated with gold and indigo. Whether the monks realized they were showing off or were simply following habit, no one could say. At the center of the festival was the fire. Built in a shallow pit lined with stones, it was not enormous, but it burned with a brightness that made people squint. The monks claimed the wood came from a grove that no longer existed, and which somehow refused to turn fully to ash. The flames licked the air in strange patterns, and the smoke rose straight upward despite the desert breeze. Around this fire, the monks performed what outsiders came to call the dance. Calling it a dance was generous. It was more like a slow, deliberate shifting of weight, a swaying from side to side, punctuated by sudden stillness. At times, the monks would raise their arms toward the stars, as if measuring the space between them. At others, they would kneel, press their foreheads to the ground, and remain motionless long enough for onlookers to start nervously glancing at each other. The whole thing lasted nearly an hour, ending with the monks clapping in perfect unison, exactly 7 times before dispersing without explanation. If anyone asked what the dance meant, the answer was always the same: "You've already seen it," which was either profoundly wise or completely unhelpful, depending on your perspective. The night wore on, and the boundaries between monks and outsiders blurred. There was laughter, debates over whose desert wine was strongest, arguments about which constellation appeared first in the season, and the quiet hum of deals being struck in the corners. It was easy to forget for a few hours that the monastery's existence was under threat. But some noticed strange details that would only seem important later. A few monks were missing, older faces that regular visitors swore had been there every other year. Certain doors, normally left ajar, were shut and barred, and there was a peculiar moment, just before midnight, when the monastery's leader, a tall, gaunt man with eyes like carved obsidian, walked the perimeter of the courtyard, pausing to whisper something to each monk he passed. No one outside the order knew what was said. As dawn approached, the festival began to wind down. Guests were gently ushered toward the gates with warm handshakes and parting gifts of bread and dried figs. The monks stood in a silent line as the last visitors stepped out into the desert light, the heavy gates swinging shut behind them with a deep, resonant thud. For those who had attended, It was a perfect ending to a strange and beautiful night. But for the monks it was something else entirely. They had celebrated their long dawn. Now, they would face the long shadow that followed. The morning after the festival of the long dawn should have been like any other morning after. Slow, hazy, and full of people pretending they didn't drink quite as much as they actually did. The desert sun had already crept up over the horizon by the time the last stragglers left the nearby dunes, where some had slept in makeshift tents, others under nothing but the indifferent stars. But inside the monastery, something was different. The gates, still shut from the night before, remained locked far longer than usual. Normally, at sunrise, the smaller visitor's door would creak open, and a few monks would step out to exchange morning greetings with whoever lingered in the outer court. This time, nothing. By the 3rd hour after dawn, 2 regular merchants, men who had been delivering dates and sesame cakes to the monks for years, began knocking on the gate. First politely, then impatiently. No answer. Eventually they gave up, muttering that the monks were probably still recovering from the festival. After all, even ascetics could be tempted by a little too much desert wine. But those who had seen the monks' unusually quiet faces the night before felt a different unease. The kind that doesn't make you angry but makes you glance back over your shoulder as you walk away. By midday, the few outsiders who had stayed nearby began to notice other oddities. Thin trails of smoke rose from the monastery's chimneys, but no one seemed to be moving around in the courtyard. The bright banners from the festival still hung from the walls, their edges stirring in the dry wind. Normally, by now monks would be pulling them down, folding them with the same ritual care they applied to everything. But the cloth stayed, as if forgotten. The first real alarm came that evening, when a small caravan of pilgrims arrived after a week-long trek, eager to see the famous community they had heard about from a trader in Kufa. They were greeted by silence. The gates were still barred, the courtyard empty. Even the faint sound of chanting which, according to every traveller's tale, could always be heard just beyond the walls, was gone. One of the pilgrims, a wiry woman with more curiosity than caution, decided to climb the outer wall. She scaled the sandstone bricks like someone who had done this sort of thing before, swung a leg over, and dropped into the courtyard. When she reappeared a moment later, her face was pale. "There's no one," she said. "No one at all." Inside, the scene was stranger than anyone could have guessed. Bowls from the festival feast still sat on low tables, half-eaten dates drying into dark lumps, cups tipped over with their contents staining the carpets. A kettle hung over the hearth in the kitchen, its coals long cold. In the scriptorium, manuscripts lay open, as though their readers had simply stood up mid-sentence and never returned. The sleeping quarters were much the same. Neatly made beds, sandals left by doorways, a scattering of personal items that suggested the owners meant to come back. In one cell, a robe hung over a chair as if its wearer had just stepped out for a moment. In another, a half-carved piece of wood rested on a workbench, chisel still embedded in its surface. There were no signs of struggle. No overturned furniture, no splashes of blood, no broken gates or smashed locks. It was as though the monks had all agreed, silently and at once, to walk away. The only clue, if it could be called that, was a series of faint footprints leading from the main courtyard toward the smaller eastern gate, a gate that was usually reserved for water deliveries from the nearby well. But those prints faded into the sand just a few dozen steps beyond the wall. By the second day, the news had spread to the nearest towns. Theories multiplied as quickly as the retellings. Some said the monks had been warned of an approaching army, and fled into the deep desert to avoid slaughter. Others whispered about a secret prophecy, that on a certain morning the brothers would be called home by their god, wherever home happened to be. One particularly inventive merchant insisted they had all discovered a hidden oasis, and decided to keep it for themselves, which, he argued, was entirely understandable. Search parties were organized, but the desert is a master at swallowing both the living and the evidence of their passing. Days of combing the surrounding dunes turned up nothing more than a few scattered belongings, a water skin here, a prayer bead there, each one too far from the next to form a trail. Meanwhile, the monastery itself began to change. Without its caretakers, the banners shredded in the wind, their colors fading under the relentless sun. Sand began to collect in the corners of the courtyard, drifting against the doors. The well in the eastern yard dried up within weeks, its rope fraying where it had been tied to the bucket. Months passed, and the mystery only deepened. Travelers still came, drawn by curiosity if not by faith. They would wander the empty halls, run their fingers over the carvings in the walls, and leave small offerings in the hope that the monks might somehow return. No one could explain why the gates, once barred, now stood ajar, as though the place itself had given up trying to keep the world out. Every so often someone claimed to have seen them. A line of robed figures moving along a ridge at dusk, or a cluster of fires glowing in the distance where no caravan route existed. These sightings were always fleeting, always unverifiable, but they were enough to keep the story alive. And so the desert monks became something else. No longer a living community, but a legend. A story told around campfires by travelers who swore they had heard chanting carried on the wind, only to find themselves utterly alone when they crested the next dune. If they were still out there, they had chosen the one thing the desert offers in abundance: silence. And in that silence their absence became louder than any words they might have spoken. It's remarkable how quickly the human mind fills an empty space with stories. Give people a monastery with no monks and you might as well hang a sign over the door that reads, "Insert your own theory here." Within weeks of the discovery, rumors about the desert monks began sprouting like stubborn desert shrubs impossible to kill, even when baked under the hottest sun. The most persistent of these tales came from camel drivers who swore they had seen the monks traveling under the cover of night. In these accounts, they were always in single file, their robes blending with the darkness, their heads bowed as if in prayer. One driver from Basra claimed he had seen them moving across a distant ridge, each carrying a staff topped with a small flame that somehow never flickered, even in the wind. This detail alone was enough to convince half his audience that the monks had mastered some ancient fire ritual. The other half suspected he had simply drunk too much date liquor. Then there was the case of the spice merchant from Aleppo, a man with a talent for embellishment that bordered on performance art. According to him, he had once been lost in the dunes for 3 days, on the verge of collapse, when he stumbled upon a cluster of tents hidden in a low valley. The inhabitants, dressed in the unmistakable white robes of the vanished order, gave him water and bread but refused to speak a single word. At dawn they gestured for him to leave, and when he looked back from the next dune, the entire camp had vanished, tents, fires and all. He later admitted, after a few too many drinks, that the bread they had given him was disappointingly stale. As the years passed, the stories grew stranger. Some claimed the monks had not vanished at all but had simply moved downward. Beneath the monastery, they said, was a network of tunnels leading to an underground sanctuary where the brothers continued their rituals away from prying eyes. This theory gained traction after a traveling mason pointed out a faint draft in the floor of the old refectory, as though air was being pulled from somewhere far below. Of course, digging in the desert has a tendency to produce more sand than answers, so the theory remained just that, a theory. Others believed the monks had gone east, following an ancient trade route into Persia, where they blended in with other ascetic communities. A few even suggested they had sailed across the Arabian Sea to India, seeking wisdom from yogis who lived in caves high above the clouds. One imaginative poet in Damascus wrote an entire epic about their supposed journey, complete with scenes of the monks debating philosophy with jeweled princes and learning the language of birds from a mystic in the mountains. The fact that none of this could be confirmed did nothing to harm the poem's popularity. There was also the persistent rumor, whispered rather than shouted, that the monks had found the fabled oasis of the moon, a place said to appear only to those pure enough of heart or stubborn enough to walk into the desert without fear of dying in it. In this version of the tale, the monks were now living in a paradise of endless water and fruit, guarded by spirits who ensured no outsider could find them. The merchants loved this version because it kept travelers romantic about the desert, which was good for business. And then there were the sightings that defied any reasonable explanation. A caravan returning from Yemen reported hearing chanting in the middle of the night, low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere beyond their camp. When a few men went to investigate, the sound seemed to move with them, always just out of reach. Eventually they gave up, only to wake the next morning and find a neat circle of stones laid out near their tents. No one admitted to arranging them. An Egyptian scribe traveling north claimed that while crossing an open stretch of sand, he had been overtaken by a sudden, inexplicable cool breeze, an impossibility in that heat, and in the shimmer of the mirage ahead, he thought he saw the silhouettes of men kneeling in prayer. When he blinked, they were gone. His companions laughed it off as heat stroke, though privately one admitted to having felt the breeze as well. Of course, for every witness, there were skeptics. Traders scoffed at the idea of monks hiding for decades in a desert that could kill a camel in a week without proper supplies. Soldiers pointed out that if the monks had been taken by force, there would have been tracks, signs, something. Scholars, meanwhile, argued that the community had likely dwindled due to harsh conditions, disease, or a simple loss of purpose, and that the vanishing was nothing more than the slow bleed of a population until no one was left to keep the gates open. But skepticism has never been as interesting as mystery. And so the whispers continued. In markets from Baghdad to Alexandria, in the back rooms of caravanserais and the shaded courtyards of desert towns, someone was always ready to lean in and say, "I heard the monks are still out there." The stories took on a life of their own, changing shape to suit the teller. In some, the monks were holy men guarding a sacred treasure. In others, they were fugitives hiding from the wrath of a forgotten king. A few darker tales painted them as keepers of forbidden knowledge, rituals so dangerous that they had sealed themselves away to prevent the rest of the world from ever finding out. By the time a generation had passed, the truth no longer mattered. The monks had crossed the invisible border between history and legend, where facts become optional, and the only thing that survives is the story itself. And in that sense, they had achieved a kind of immortality, for while their bodies might have been swallowed by the desert, their absence walked freely through every city and camp, carried in the mouths of those who had never seen them, but swore they knew exactly where they had gone. The desert is not static. To the untrained eye, it looks frozen in time. The same dunes, the same endless horizons, the same color palette of sun-bleached tan and sky-burnt blue. But for anyone who lives in it, the desert is a restless creature. It shifts, it swallows, it erases, and it doesn't leave a note to explain where it's put things. In the decades following the monks' disappearance, the landscape around their abandoned monastery began to change in ways both ordinary and unnerving. First came the winds, not the occasional seasonal gusts, but long, unbroken weeks of dry, sand-heavy gales that could strip the bark from an acacia tree and turn the air into something that stung the skin. The locals said the winds were angry, though about what, no one could agree. Some blamed the monks for disturbing something they shouldn't have. Others decided the desert simply didn't like to be left alone. The first big shift happened one summer, when a wall of sand swallowed half the monastery's outer enclosure. Merchants passing through barely recognized it. The high stone walls that had once been visible for miles were now half buried, their carved inscriptions hidden beneath drifts of pale gold. If the monks had hoped to leave their mark on the land was making its opinion very clear. Travelers noted that certain familiar landmarks were disappearing too. A jagged black ridge used by caravans for navigation had collapsed after a rare but violent desert storm. An old well, long considered a reliable stop, was found choked with sand. Even the paths between dunes, those invisible trails that experienced guides swear they can see, began to change so often that seasoned camel drivers lost their bearings. The desert's ability to erase was not limited to geography. Human memory is a fragile thing, and as the years rolled on, fewer people could recall exactly where the monastery had been. Oh, they knew the general region, somewhere between this oasis and that ruined fort. But pinning it down to an exact location became slippery. Ask 10 travelers and you'd get 10 slightly different maps drawn in the sand with a stick. Each map would be accompanied by a confident nod, as if the teller had personally measured the distance with their own feet. By the 50th year after the vanishing, the monastery was already slipping into the category of places you talk about but don't actually visit. Stories still circulated in the cities and the desert towns, but the physical reality of it was becoming more myth than memory. When occasional expeditions were mounted to find it, they would return empty-handed, their members sunburned, sand-caked and muttering about mirages that led them astray. One such expedition was led by a particularly determined scholar from Alexandria. He arrived in the desert armed with maps, scrolls, a compass, and the kind of optimism that makes people think they're immune to common sense. His caravan wandered for 3 weeks before stumbling back into civilization with no monastery, no clear answers, and 3 camels fewer than when they'd started. The scholar, to his credit, did write a book about his journey, though most of it was complaints about sand in his teeth. The weather, too, seemed to conspire against would-be discoverers. In the years when someone claimed to know the way, the heat would rise to unbearable levels, or the sandstorms would be so constant that no caravan dared risk it. In cooler seasons, flash floods from distant rains would cut off the approach routes, turning normally dry wadis into temporary impassable rivers. It was as though the desert had appointed itself guardian of whatever lay hidden out there. By now the monks' disappearance had taken on an entirely different flavor. It wasn't just a question of where they had gone, but of whether they had been claimed by the desert itself. Some storytellers insisted the earth had swallowed them whole, monastery and all, leaving no trace. Others spoke of a slow merging, that the monks had simply walked out into the dunes one day and kept walking until they were no longer visible, becoming part of the sand, their voices carried forever in the wind. Not everyone was content with such poetic explanations. Treasure hunters, opportunists, and the occasional bored noble still tried their luck. Most returned with nothing but sunburn and a sack of rocks they swore were ancient relics. One particularly entrepreneurial fellow began selling fragments of the monastery wall in a market in Damascus. His customers were impressed until someone pointed out the suspicious similarity between these fragments and the decorative stonework from a demolished public bathhouse in the city. And yet, despite all the failed searches, the desert still teased people with clues. A half-buried archway spotted by a passing caravan. A carved stone block uncovered after a rare rainstorm. A faint trace of chanting heard on a windless night. Each sighting was enough to spark a fresh round of interest. Another expedition, another set of theories. The monastery might be gone, but it was never entirely forgotten. It's possible that this is exactly how the monks would have wanted it. After all, they had chosen the desert, a place where permanence is an illusion, as the stage for their lives. Perhaps their disappearance was just the final act in a long performance, one last lesson in the art of letting go. Or perhaps the desert, with its shifting moods and restless sands, simply decided to keep them for itself. Either way, by the time a full century had passed, the location of the monastery had become a matter of faith rather than fact. You either believed it was still out there, somewhere beyond the reach of modern feet, or you accepted that it had been erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. And in the desert, belief can be as enduring as stone, even if the stone is long gone. If there's one thing scholars love more than discovering the truth, it's arguing about it. The disappearance of the desert monks was like catnip to them. A mystery with just enough fragments to fight over, and just enough gaps to make sure no one could win the argument outright. The first serious scholarly debate began in the Library of Cairo, sometime in the late 10th century. A group of learned men, each robed in their finest scholarly silks, gathered to discuss the issue. This was, of course, a polite way of saying they were there to politely insult each other's theories over trays of dates and spiced wine. One camp insisted the monks had been wiped out by raiders. They pointed to accounts from camel drivers, who claimed to have seen smoke rising in the distance during the season of the vanishing. Obvious sign of attack, they said, sipping smugly at their wine. Likely Bedouin tribes who had grown tired of the monks taking the best water from the wells. The opposing camp argued this was nonsense. The monks were respected, even admired by nearby tribes. They exchanged goods, shared water, and treated the sick. No one in their right mind would risk the wrath of the desert spirits by harming holy men. It was famine, they declared, or disease, or both. The first camp snorted into their wine cups. A third group, smaller, quieter, but far more dramatic, leaned back in their chairs and said, "You're all wrong. They chose to vanish." This camp believed the monks had intentionally walked deeper into the desert, seeking some kind of ultimate union with the divine, their physical bodies discarded like old sandals. This, they claimed, was why no bodies or remains were ever found. The arguments grew heated, not least because the evidence was so frustratingly thin. There were a few scraps of writing from visitors to the monastery, most of them describing the monks' unusual diets, strict routines, and their curious habit of singing at night. None mentioned any trouble brewing, no hints of famine, raids, or planned disappearances, just lines about how peaceful and slightly unsettling the place was. One particularly ambitious scholar from Damascus decided he would settle the matter once and for all by collecting every possible account of the monks from travelers, merchants, and pilgrims. His compilation was impressive, until people noticed that his sources often contradicted each other in hilarious ways. One merchant swore the monks had vanished in the middle of winter, another claimed it was during the hottest summer on record, a third insisted they were still alive, running a date farm near the coast. It didn't help that some later writers began to embellish the story. A poet in Baghdad added a subplot involving a mysterious woman who visited the monastery in the weeks before the disappearance, a detail found nowhere in earlier accounts. A monk in a distant monastery wrote that the vanished brothers had discovered a hidden gate to the world beneath the sand and stepped through it. This was repeated enough times that it began to sound almost plausible to some. By the 13th century, the scholarly disputes had hardened into what could only be described as academic rivalries. There were entire careers built on trying to prove one theory or disprove another. Debates would spill over into public forums, where learned men would stand in the heat for hours, waving scrolls and pointing fingers, while small crowds gathered not so much for the content, but for the spectacle. There's something irresistibly entertaining about watching people in elaborate robes argue like fishmongers. Then came the Great Symposium in Alexandria, an event billed as the ultimate meeting of minds to finally resolve the matter. It lasted 4 days. On the first day, they argued about whether the monastery was closer to the western dunes or the eastern. On the second, they argued about the number of monks, whether there were 20, 30, or perhaps 100. On the third, they descended into a fierce quarrel over what exactly counted as vanishing. By the fourth day, everyone had agreed on only one thing: the wine had run out. The symposium ended without resolution, but with several new grudges formed. The irony, of course, was that while the scholars bickered in cities and libraries, the actual desert continued to shift, erase and hide whatever clues might have existed. Every year the debate continued. Was another year the sands covered more of the truth. It's entirely possible that by the time the last of these arguing scholars died, the remains of the monastery were already buried too deep for anyone to find. Some suspected this was part of the monks' genius. If they really had chosen to disappear, they had done so in a way that made even the most educated minds chase their own tails for centuries. Their absence became a kind of intellectual playground, one that produced far more heated conversations than actual discoveries. And yet, the debates had their value. They kept the story alive. Without these tireless, squabbling scholars, the tale of the monks might have faded into nothing more than a local legend. Instead, it spread across empires, whispered in bazaars, scribbled into chronicles, and recited by storytellers who didn't care whether it was true so long as it was captivating. Of course, the scholars themselves would have hated that. For them, truth was the prize, not the story. And so, even as the centuries rolled on, they kept returning to the same question: where had the monks gone? Each new generation thought it might be the one to crack the mystery. Each generation left behind more theories, more contradictions, and more entertainment for the rest of us. In the end, the desert didn't have to lift a finger. The scholars were doing a fine job of hiding the truth from themselves. Long before the scholars had finished their first round of wine-fueled arguments, there were already other voices in the mix. Voices far less polished, far less concerned with academic respectability, and far more colourful. These were the pilgrims. The desert monastery had been a popular stop for spiritual travellers in its day. People came from across the known world, dusty traders from the Levant, wide-eyed Copts from the Nile Delta, even sandal-wearing Greeks who somehow believed a week in the dunes would make them enlightened. They came for blessings, for healing, for penance, or sometimes just because someone told them the bread there was the best in all Egypt. When the monks vanished, these former visitors suddenly found themselves with a priceless commodity, a story. And, as any good storyteller knows, a little mystery is worth far more than the truth. The first such tale came from a wiry, sunburnt pilgrim named Hakim, who claimed he had been there only a month before the disappearance. Over a cup of watered wine in a Cairo tavern, he told anyone who would listen that the monks had been restless. They prayed more than usual, he said, leaning forward dramatically, even during meals, and they spoke of dreams of a great light moving across the sand, calling them. Hakim's account would have been more convincing if he hadn't also claimed that one of the monks secretly taught him how to turn lead into gold. Still, it caught the imagination of the city. Not to be outdone, a Greek sailor passing through insisted that, on his return journey from India, he had heard from a caravan leader that the monks had been seen walking single file into a sandstorm without supplies, without hesitation. They were singing, he added with theatrical flair, as if they were following something only they could see. A Syrian spice merchant swore he had visited the monastery 2 years before the vanishing, and had been told, quite directly, by the abbot himself, that the brothers would one day leave this world behind. The merchant failed to mention this until after the disappearance, of course, which made some suspicious. The most bizarre account came from a wandering ascetic who appeared in Damascus a decade later. He claimed he had been wandering deep in the desert when he came upon a strange oasis, a place of shimmering heat and unnaturally green palms. There, he said, were the monks, alive and well, dressed in white robes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. They gave him water, bread, and dates, and told him to leave. When he returned a week later, the oasis was gone. This story, predictably, was met with laughter in some circles, and hushed wonder in others. The ascetic's reputation didn't help. He was known to live on little more than figs and opium smoke, which had been affecting his visions for years. But the thing about pilgrim tales is that they don't need to be entirely believable to survive. In fact, the less certain they are, the more they seem to multiply. Word of the monks' disappearance spread beyond Egypt, beyond the Levant, beyond the Mediterranean. Soon there were Armenians claiming they had seen similar robed figures near the mountains. Ethiopians whispered of strangers who appeared in the highlands, healed the sick, and vanished before dawn. An old man in the markets of Baghdad swore his cousin's neighbour's uncle had been rescued from a desert storm by men who looked like monks, and who then walked straight into the wind until they disappeared. By the time these stories reached Europe, they had taken on an entirely new shape. In Venice, a group of traders told of white priests who had sailed down the Red Sea and vanished into the Indian Ocean. In Paris, someone insisted the monks had discovered the location of the Garden of Eden and were living there in eternal bliss. By the time the tale reached the colder parts of England, the monks were supposedly building a monastery in the clouds. What united all these tales wasn't their accuracy, but the way they made people feel, a mix of wonder, longing, and just a little envy. The idea that someone could simply walk away from the world and vanish into some higher purpose was both inspiring and infuriating. After all, most people couldn't even leave their village without asking permission. In this way, the monks' vanishing became less a historical event and more a mirror. People saw in it whatever they wanted to believe. For the devout, it was proof of divine favor. For the superstitious, it was evidence of strange forces lurking beyond the dunes. For the cynical, it was just a desert tragedy wrapped in too much incense and rumor. Of course, the monks themselves never showed up to confirm or deny any of it, assuming they were still alive to do so. That silence only made the tales grow louder. And while the scholars were busy arguing over dates and causes, the pilgrims' stories ensured that the monks would never be entirely forgotten. They lived on not in archives, but in the kind of smoky taverns and bustling marketplaces where stories are traded like coins, and where a good mystery can survive for centuries. For centuries, the desert held its tongue. It had swallowed the monks their monastery and every scrap of evidence with the quiet satisfaction of a cat that's eaten the last pigeon. Sand is like that, patient, smug, and in no hurry to explain itself. But deserts are also careless. Every now and then the wind changes, the dunes shift, and the past gets exposed like a drunk uncle at a wedding. It happened during the reign of a particularly bored Mamluk governor, whose idea of entertainment was funding expeditions into the desert to look for anything interesting. The real purpose was less noble. His soldiers were restless, and sending them to wander the dunes kept them from stabbing each other in the barracks. One such expedition, led by a man named Yusuf ibn Karim, had been trudging for 3 days without finding so much as a broken amphora. On the 4th day, the wind picked up. It wasn't the kind of sandstorm that strips flesh from bone, more of a persistent nagging wind that got into your ears, your teeth, and your soul. By evening, the horizon looked different. The next morning, they saw it. Half buried in the sand was the corner of a wall, not a natural rock formation, not a caravan ruin, but an actual wall, smooth stone blocks cut and fitted with a precision the desert rarely tolerates. Yusuf's men started digging with their hands before the camels had even sat down. As they cleared more sand, the structure revealed itself, a section of what seemed to be an outer wall, with the faint remains of painted symbols. Most were too faded to read, but one stood out, a simple, deliberate carving of a circle with a cross inside it, surrounded by rays. It looked like a sun, but older somehow, as if the artist had seen the sun in a dream, rather than in the sky. Near the base of the wall, Yusuf found a slab of stone covered in inscriptions. They were in a script no one in the party recognized. Not Arabic, not Greek, not Coptic, not anything a desert soldier with limited literacy could guess. The markings were sharp and deep, protected from the wind by centuries of sand. One of Yusuf's men, a veteran from Nubia, swore he saw similar markings once in a monastery far to the south. They said it was the language of the angels, he muttered. No one laughed. As the dig continued, they uncovered the edge of what looked like a doorway. It wasn't large, just enough for a single person to pass through at a time, and it was sealed by more sand and collapsed stone. But even in its ruined state, it radiated something intentional. The kind of doorway you build not for convenience, but for ceremony. By dusk, they had unearthed enough to confirm it wasn't just a random ruin. The construction was too deliberate, the placement too strategic. It faced a specific point on the horizon, directly where the sun would rise on the spring equinox. Yusuf knew this because his father had been a stargazer, the kind of man who could tell the time of year just by looking at the shadows. That night, as the wind howled outside their camp, Yusuf sat staring at the slab. The symbols seemed almost to shift in the flickering firelight. Though he blamed that on exhaustion and bad dates, he considered taking the stone back to the governor, but quickly realized how impractical that was. The thing weighed more than a camel, and wouldn't fit neatly into a saddlebag. The next morning, they found fresh sand drifts had already begun swallowing the site again. It was like the desert had noticed its mistake, and was trying to cover it up. They worked quickly, sketching the inscriptions onto parchment. Yusuf ordered 2 of his most trustworthy men to guard the slab, while the others scouted the surrounding dunes. They found nothing else. No bones, no tools, no pottery, no indication of daily life. If this had been part of the monks' monastery, it was only a fragment, a scrap left behind after the rest had been carried away by time. When Yusuf returned to Cairo, the sketches caused a small sensation among the scholars. Some claimed the symbols were Proto-Sinitic. Others swore they were from a lost Mesopotamian dialect. One particularly excitable monk insisted they were instructions for a ritual, though his translation read suspiciously like a recipe for spiced lentils. The most intriguing theory came from an old Jewish scholar who had spent years studying apocryphal texts. He suggested the markings were a kind of map, not of the physical world, but of the path between worlds. When asked what that meant, he only smiled and said, "It means exactly what it sounds like," which helped no one. Within months, the slab itself had disappeared from the governor's storerooms. Some said it was stolen by a rival ruler. Others whispered that the scholars who studied it performed some ill-advised ritual. And well, let's just say their rooms were found empty one morning. The site in the desert, of course, vanished again under the sands. Yusuf tried to return the next year but couldn't find it. The dunes had shifted, the landmarks changed, and the desert had reasserted its infuriating dominance. Still, the discovery was enough to breathe life back into the mystery of the vanished monks. If this was part of their monastery, it meant they had once left behind something built to last, something they expected to be found. And if it wasn't theirs, then it was part of something even older. Either way, the desert had spoken, briefly, slyly, and with just enough detail to ensure no one would ever shut up about it again. If you've ever left something interesting lying around in a busy market, a gold coin, a cryptic note, an oddly shaped piece of pottery, you'll know what happens next. People will invent stories about it, wild stories, and the stranger the object, the stranger the storytellers. The slab from Yusuf's desert find was no different. By the time word of it spread through Cairo's scholars, merchants and holy men, it had acquired at least 6 completely different identities. Depending on who you asked, it was 1. A sacred altar from the time of Solomon. 2. The foundation stone of a vanished city. 3. A door to the underworld, though inconveniently missing the actual door. 4. The tombstone of a saint no one could name. 5. Proof that Atlantis had trading posts in the desert. 6. Or, if you asked the particularly excitable monk from earlier, the oldest recipe in history. Naturally, the more ridiculous the theory, the faster it spread. Cairo in those days had no shortage of self-proclaimed experts who would happily deliver a lecture about the slab's true purpose to anyone who'd buy them lunch. The problem was, some of them sounded just convincing enough to make you wonder. There was Father Anselm, a rotund Dominican, who had been in Egypt for exactly 3 months before declaring himself the leading authority on ancient Eastern Christian relics. He claimed the slab was a dedication stone, placed at the heart of a lost monastery by monks who had taken vows not just of poverty and silence, but of geographical erasure. When pressed, he explained this meant they deliberately removed their location from all maps. A holy hide-and-seek, he called it, with an air of satisfaction that suggested he'd just invented the idea. Then there was Al-Hakim, a poet who claimed to have dreamed the truth. In his dream, the monks had not died at all, but had walked, in perfect silence, into a desert dawn until the horizon itself opened like a curtain. On the other side, he said, was a green land with rivers of milk and honey. He described it in such detail that you almost forgot it was clearly stolen from a dozen Quranic metaphors. His followers, because of course he had followers, began making pilgrimages into the desert in hopes of finding this veil. Most came back sunburned, dehydrated, and with a new appreciation for shade. One of the most entertaining contributors to the debate was a Venetian trader named Marco di Rossi, who swore he had seen a slab exactly like this one in a monastery in the Far East. Which Far East he never specified, but he assured everyone it was very far indeed. His theory was that the monks were part of a global network of ascetics who shared knowledge through these stones, each one inscribed with a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, would reveal the ultimate secret of the world. Conveniently, no 2 stones had ever been seen together in the same place, which made it impossible to disprove him. Meanwhile, the serious scholars, the ones who actually knew their scripts from their soup recipes, were no less divided. Some thought the language on the slab was a primitive alphabet predating known Semitic scripts. Others argued it was symbolic, more akin to a ritual code than a written tongue. A few privately admitted they had no idea but were unwilling to say so in public for fear of being outshouted by the lunatics. And then there was the matter of the slab's disappearance. No one could agree on who had taken it. The governor predictably denied everything. Some whispered it had been stolen by agents of a rival emir in Damascus, who planned to use it as proof that his lands were the rightful site of the lost holy city. Others said it was in the hands of a secretive Sufi order who believed the slab contained a hidden prayer capable of unlocking divine visions. A more cynical faction suggested it had simply been broken up and sold in pieces to rich collectors. Half of Cairo's merchants are probably using it as a coffee table by now, one wit remarked, which earned a laugh but no real evidence. Despite the absence of the object itself, the mystery of the monks surged back into public imagination. Old travelers' tales were dusted off and retold with fresh embellishments. Caravan guides began offering monk vanishing tours, leading gullible visitors into the desert to stare meaningfully at piles of sand. Even the market started selling authentic monk relics, bits of pottery, wooden beads, and, in one case, a camel skull that the seller swore belonged to the monk's sacred beast. In this chaos of speculation, one curious fact emerged. Among the few who had seen the slab in person, more than one reported a strange sensation while standing near it. Some felt an inexplicable calm, as if the noise of the world had been turned down. Others spoke of a faint vibration in the stone, like the purr of a sleeping animal. One particularly dramatic witness claimed it made his dreams more vivid for a week afterward, though this may have had more to do with the wine he'd been drinking at the time. The slab had become more than an artifact. It was now a story, a riddle, and, for some, a calling. People were no longer just asking what happened to the monks. They were asking what were they trying to leave behind. And in the way of all good mysteries, the more people argued, the less anyone seemed to agree, which, of course, only guaranteed the story would live on, twisting, growing, and collecting new theories like a camel collects flies. If Cairo had been buzzing with competing theories about the vanished monks, the arrival of the hermit of Wadi al-Najm was like throwing a live scorpion into a teacup. Everyone immediately forgot their own stories in favor of hearing his. He appeared one evening at the city gates, barefoot, sun-blackened, and wearing a robe the color of desert sand, though it was difficult to tell if that was intentional or simply the result of never washing it. He was lean to the point of bony, with a long white beard that looked like it had survived at least 2 sandstorms, and eyes so pale they seemed almost colorless. The guards would later claim he stared at them as if looking through them, which was either unnerving or simply a sign of poor eyesight. The hermit's name, or at least the one he offered, was ibn Sahal. He claimed to have lived for 20 years in a cave in the Wadi al-Najm valley, surviving on dates, goat's milk, and the light of God. This last claim was delivered with such sincerity that you almost didn't notice how implausible it was as a nutritional plan. Ishaq wasted no time in declaring that he knew what had happened to the monks. "I walked the same sand they walked," he told the crowd that gathered around him in the market. "I drank from the same hidden wells, and I saw with my own eyes the place where they vanished." Now, Cairo had heard its share of desert prophets, men who claimed visions, miracles, or, in one unfortunate case, ownership of the moon. But something about Ishaq was different. He spoke slowly, with long pauses, as if each word was being weighed on an invisible scale, and his voice carried the roughness of someone who had spoken very little in 2 decades, which only made people lean in closer. According to Ishaq, the monks had been part of an order older than Christianity, older than the Roman Empire, perhaps even older than the pyramids. They knew the desert like a man knows his own heartbeat, he said. They had chosen their home not at random, but at the exact crossing of ancient lines of power, invisible paths where the earth's energy flowed strongest. They were guardians, Ishaq said, of a doorway not built by human hands. That was all it took for the crowd to swell. Merchants closed their stalls, beggars abandoned their pitches, even a few scholars slipped into the press of listeners. Doorways, especially mystical ones, were infinitely more interesting than another debate about pottery shards. Ishaq described how the monks had lived apart from the world, not out of contempt, but because the world made too much noise. They rose with the stars, prayed without words, and kept their days in strict silence, speaking only in signs. Their food was simple: bread baked in the sand, herbs grown in hidden gardens, and a thin soup made from roots and goat's milk. Once a month, they ventured to an oasis to trade with passing caravans, exchanging medicinal herbs and hand-carved talismans for salt, cloth, and the occasional copper pot. And then, one night, they were gone. Ishaq claimed he had visited their monastery the very morning after it happened. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, not even a disturbed grain of sand where their footprints should have been. The cooking fire was still smouldering, bowls half filled with soup. A single wooden cup lay on its side, its contents soaked into the sand. When asked where they went, Ishak would only say, "They stepped into the place they had been guarding." Naturally, this prompted questions. What was this place? Where was it? Could it be found again? Ishak, however, had the irritating habit of answering questions with more questions. If a man has a key to a door that leads beyond this world, he asked one listener, should he give it to someone who has never even learned to close his own? Still, he dropped hints. The monastery, he said, was 5 days' walk past the well that tastes of iron. The doorway lay in a valley shaped like the crescent moon, marked by 2 pillars of stone that no wind could topple. He warned that only those who approached in absolute silence could find it. Anyone who spoke, even a whisper, would find themselves walking in circles until the sun burned the courage out of them. Some in the crowd dismissed him as a lunatic. Others began plotting expeditions before he'd even finished speaking. One enterprising spice merchant offered Ishak a small fortune to guide him there. But the hermit shook his head. "It is not mine to give," he said simply. The scholars, of course, tried to trip him up with questions about history and language. How old was the order, really? Did they leave written records? Had Ishak seen the infamous slab from Yusuf's dig? Ishak's answers were infuriatingly vague. Older than kings, they wrote on the wind, and the stone was only one of many, were the kinds of replies he offered, which did nothing to clarify matters. And yet, there were those who swore his story rang true. They pointed out that certain details matched old travel accounts: the crescent-shaped valley, the 2 pillars, the iron-tasting well. Some even whispered that Ishak himself might be the last of their kind, left behind to ensure no one unworthy found the doorway. By the time he left the city, vanishing as abruptly as he had arrived, Ishak had ensured the monk's legend would outlive them by centuries. Theories multiplied, expeditions set out and failed, and the mystery of the vanished monks took on a new, tantalizing shape. Perhaps they had not died at all, but simply left for where, exactly? That, as Ishak might have said, was the wrong question. The first official expedition to find the Crescent Valley began with more confidence than supplies, which, in the desert, is a dangerous ratio. The man leading it was Captain Hamid al-Rashwan, a former Ottoman officer whose military career had ended after he accidentally shelled his own camp during a night maneuver. It was decided, for everyone's safety, that he would be better suited to private ventures. Hamid was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed the kind of moustache that seemed to operate independently of its owner. He'd heard Ishak's tale in the Cairo market, and declared loudly and repeatedly that he could find the valley in less than a week. "The desert speaks to me," he told anyone who would listen. Given his track record, it was unclear whether the desert's messages were entirely friendly. The expedition numbered 12 men in total. Hamid, 2 camel drivers, a cook, a mapmaker named Farouk, 3 hired guards, and 4 enthusiastic volunteers, whose qualifications appeared to be owning wide-brimmed hats. They carried enough water for 12 days, food for 10, and optimism for perhaps 3. Before leaving, Hamid had studied Ishak's cryptic clues, as if they were military orders. 5 days' walk past the well that tastes of iron, he repeated, tracing imaginary lines on Farouk's map. 2 pillars of stone in a crescent valley, and silence, absolute silence. Farouk, who had spent enough time in the desert to know that silence was more often interrupted by wind, camels, and the occasional inexplicable scream, raised an eyebrow. "We can try," he said. The first 2 days were almost uneventful, except for a minor incident in which one of the guards attempted to chase a mirage he swore was a caravan of gold. By day 3, they reached the iron-tasting well. True to Ishak's words, the water left a metallic tang on the tongue, as though one were drinking liquefied coins. Hamid declared it a sign they were on the right path, though Farouk privately noted that several other wells in the region tasted the same. From there, they entered terrain that maps politely labelled uninhabitable. The sand here shifted underfoot as if it were trying to avoid being walked on. The wind carried fine dust that got into eyes, ears, and even dreams. On the 4th night, the cook woke everyone by shouting that he'd seen figures moving along the dunes. The guards found nothing, but the next morning, strange patterns had appeared in the sand, spirals, as if drawn by an invisible hand. Hamid decided this was a good omen. Farouk decided to stop sleeping. On the 5th day, they reached the edge of a valley shaped indeed like a crescent moon. 2 pillars of dark stone rose from its entrance, standing side by side like ancient sentinels. The air here felt different. Still heavy, as though the wind itself were holding its breath. And then came the real challenge. Silence. Hamid ordered everyone to speak no word from the moment they stepped between the pillars. This was more difficult than it sounded. The camel drivers immediately forgot and shouted at their animals. The cook cursed when he burned his hand on a pot. One of the volunteers sneezed so loudly it startled a guard into dropping his rifle. Each time Hamid would glare and point to his moustache, which apparently had become the symbol for shut your mouth. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Footsteps sounded muffled, as if the sand was swallowing the noise. Farouk noticed the shadows of the pillars seemed longer than they should be, stretching impossibly far across the valley floor. The camels grew restless, refusing to walk in a straight line. Twice, the group found themselves circling back to the same spot without realizing it. By the second day in the valley, tempers were fraying. Without conversation to distract them, the men began to notice unsettling details. Rocks shaped like human faces, sudden drops in temperature, and an occasional flicker at the edge of vision, as though someone or something were walking just behind them. That night, while the others slept, Farouk climbed a ridge to study the valley from above. What he saw made no sense. The crescent shape seemed to shift depending on where he stood, sometimes narrowing, sometimes widening, and in the exact center, barely visible in the moonlight, was what looked like the outline of a building, or perhaps the shadow of one. The next morning, Hamid announced they would make for that central spot. It took nearly 6 hours to cross the valley. Their progress slowed by disorienting turns and inexplicable obstacles, a boulder that hadn't been there moments before, a sudden gust of wind that erased their footprints. When they finally arrived, they found nothing. No building, no doorway, just a patch of bare, flat sand. The disappointment was immediate. One of the volunteers muttered that Ishaq had been a liar. The cook threw down his ladle in disgust. But Farouk, crouching down, brushed away a thin layer of sand and froze. Beneath it was stone, perfectly smooth, etched with faint lines that curved like waves. Before they could examine it further, the wind rose sharply, whipping sand into their faces. The camels began to panic. Hamid shouted, forgetting the vow of silence, and the moment the sound left his mouth, everything seemed to change. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthened unnaturally, and just for an instant, the smooth stone under Farouk's hand seemed to shimmer like water. Then the sand closed over it again. By the time they staggered back to the pillars, the sun was setting. No one spoke for the rest of the journey home. In Cairo, Hamid claimed the valley was cursed. Farouk said nothing at all, and somewhere in the Wadi al-Najm, the wind continued to draw spirals in the sand. If the first expedition to Crescent Valley had been a cautious step into mystery, the second was more of a bold, some might say reckless leap. It was led not by Captain Hamid, who had sworn off deserts in favor of running a questionable coffee shop in Cairo, but by a man named Anton Varga. Varga was Hungarian by birth, archaeologist by trade, and troublemaker by nature. He had the unshakable conviction that every ancient mystery could be solved by just digging a little deeper, an approach that had earned him equal parts fame and expulsion from several archaeological societies. His hair, perpetually windblown, gave him the appearance of someone in the middle of a perpetual argument with the weather. When Varga heard Ishaq's story and Hamid's account of the Crescent Valley, he didn't hesitate. If the valley hides something, he told the gathered crowd at a tavern, then we shall find it, and if it hides nothing, then at least we will have proven it is very good at hiding. His audience laughed. Some laughed because they thought he was joking. Others laughed because they had already decided they would join him. This second expedition was smaller but more specialized. Alongside Varga came a geologist named Dr. Layla Qureshi, a Bedouin tracker called Salman, 2 seasoned labourers from Luxor, and a British photographer, Arthur Trent, whose moustache rivaled Hamid's for both volume and attitude. They brought camels, excavation tools, a month's worth of provisions, and, most importantly, a plan. Follow Ishaq's instructions precisely, but remain in the valley long enough to investigate the strange stone Farouk had uncovered. The journey began smoothly. Salman led them unerringly to the iron-tasting well, then onward to the crescent-shaped valley. The pillars stood just as Hamid had described, dark, solemn, and somehow older than everything around them. The silence that followed was immediate and unsettling, like the air itself had learned to listen. Varga, not one for superstition, ignored the vow of silence entirely. "We will talk," he declared, "because talking keeps the mind sharp." Salman muttered that in the desert. Talking also attracted things you might not want to meet, but Varga was not in the habit of listening to people who knew better. For 2 days they mapped the valley, marking every boulder, dune, and oddly shaped shadow. The strange patterns in the sand appeared again, this time more elaborate, interlocking circles and spirals, as if a giant hand were sketching geometry lessons no one had asked for. Dr. Qureshi noted that the designs were too precise to be random, though she couldn't guess how they were made. On the third day, they reached the center of the valley. Once again, the flat patch of sand concealed the smooth, wave-etched stone. This time, Varga was ready. The laborers began clearing sand, while Trent took photographs, the camera's mechanical clicks sounding far too loud in the oppressive stillness. As more of the stone was revealed, a pattern emerged. Not random lines, but carvings resembling script. The problem was that the script did not match any known language. It curled and twisted in ways that suggested meaning, yet resisted translation. Dr. Qureshi said it reminded her of ancient Proto-Semitic forms. Salman said it looked more like the desert itself was writing. Then came the moment that turned intrigue into fear. As Varga crouched to brush away the last of the sand from a corner of the stone, he froze. "There's an opening," he said, voice low. Indeed, just beneath the surface, a narrow slit had appeared, leading down into darkness. The air that rose from it was cool, dry, and carried a faint scent, not of decay, but of something metallic and ancient, like the inside of a long-sealed chest. Without hesitation, Varga tied a rope around his waist and prepared to descend. Dr. Qureshi protested, pointing out that they had no idea how deep it was, or what might be inside. Varga waved her off with the casual arrogance of a man convinced history only rewarded the impatient. He disappeared into the darkness. Minutes passed, then half an hour, then an hour. Salman called down, his voice swallowed by the silence. Trent suggested pulling Varga up, but when they tugged the rope, they found it slack and cut clean through as if sliced by a blade. The group stared at one another, the desert suddenly feeling like it had drawn closer. Dr. Qureshi wanted to leave immediately. Trent argued for one more attempt, but Salman's expression ended the debate. "The valley," he said quietly, "takes what it wants." They left the rope where it lay, half buried in sand, and retreated to the pillars without looking back. The journey home was tense, marked by uneasy glances over shoulders and the constant feeling of being followed. Back in Cairo, the story spread quickly. Varga had vanished without a trace, swallowed by the Crescent Valley just as the monks had centuries before. Some said he had found their hidden sanctuary and chosen not to return. Others whispered he had angered whatever spirit guarded the place. Dr. Qureshi locked away her notes and never spoke of the expedition again. Salman refused to guide anyone to the valley, no matter the payment. And Trent's photographs, the ones he managed to develop, showed the stone clearly, the strange script visible under the harsh light. But in one image, a shadow stretched across the carving, long and thin, in the shape of a man who wasn't there when the picture was taken. The story of Varga's disappearance made its way through Cairo faster than a rumor about free tea. By the time it reached the cafes along the Nile, he had either been abducted by ancient monks, fallen into a bottomless chasm, or turned into a pile of dust in a single sunbeam. Nobody could agree on the details, but everyone agreed on one thing. The Crescent Valley was no longer just a forgotten stretch of desert, it was cursed. Most dismissed the talk as exaggerated nonsense. But not Professor Basil al-Rahman. Basil was the sort of scholar who lived for the moments when history and absurdity shook hands. He was short, with spectacles that seemed permanently smudged, and a wardrobe that consisted entirely of mismatched waistcoats. He had a reputation at the University of Alexandria for delivering lectures that started with ancient Mesopotamian law and somehow ended with a story about a goat that once wandered into a Roman courtroom. When he heard about Varga, he didn't laugh. Instead, he sifted through his enormous collection of notes, scrolls, and dust-covered manuscripts until he found a brittle folio that he'd acquired decades earlier from a trader in Damascus. The trader had sworn it was copied from a much older text, one so ancient that even its copyist had no idea who wrote the original. It was called The Account of the Last Walkers. Basil read through it again, his finger tracing the faded ink. The text spoke of men in robes the color of sand, who had built their monastery far beyond the sight of mountains or rivers, in a place where the sun bent low to listen. These men, it claimed, had sworn an oath to remain in that place until the veil between life and the beyond was lifted. It was said they vanished together, stepping through a doorway no eyes could see. Most historians would have filed the tale under romantic nonsense. But Basil noticed something else. The manuscript mentioned a crescent-shaped formation of stone pillars, and beyond them, a wide plain marked with circles in the dust. It was too specific to be coincidence. He arranged a meeting with Dr. Lila Qureshi, who had returned from the doomed expedition with more questions than answers. She wasn't keen to revisit the subject, but Basil had an advantage. He could be incredibly irritating when he wanted to be. Over a long and exhausting lunch, he laid out his theory. The monks had not simply vanished. They had been preparing for something, perhaps an astronomical event, perhaps something stranger. Varga found what they left behind, Basil said, leaning in. And it took him the way it took them. Qureshi frowned. You're assuming it was deliberate, that the monks wanted to disappear. I'm assuming, Basil replied, that no one builds a monastery in a place like that by accident, and that whatever they found was worth staying for. She didn't want to believe him, but the description of the crescent pillars in the folio gnawed at her. Basil offered to show her the manuscript, which, despite smelling faintly of onions, was compelling. News of Basil's theory spread to a small but dedicated group of researchers and adventurers. One of them was Edmund Varley, a retired British officer who'd been wandering the Middle East in search of something he never specified what. Since the 1920s, Varley was skeptical of curses, but loved the idea of solving a mystery that had already swallowed a man whole. Varley visited Basil in Alexandria and listened to the account in full. He even brought a flask of whiskey, which Basil claimed he only accepted for scientific purposes. Together they pored over maps, old travellers' journals, and the photographs taken by Arthur Trent. It was Trent's photo of the shadow over the carved stone that caught Varley's attention. This, he said, tapping the image, looks like someone standing just out of frame. Someone tall, someone watching. Basil admitted he had no explanation. The shadow didn't match anyone in the party, and its proportions were off too narrow in the shoulders, too long in the arms. By the time Varley left, he had made up his mind. He would go to the valley himself. Basil tried to dissuade him, arguing that 2 disappearances were quite enough to prove a point. But Varley just grinned. If history waited for caution, he said, we'd still be wondering what fire is for. Before leaving, Varley asked Basil for a copy of the account of the last walkers. Basil reluctantly made one, adding a note at the bottom, "Do not go where the circles lie unless you are prepared not to return." Varley folded the paper, pocketed it, and walked out into the Alexandrian sun, as if heading for an afternoon stroll rather than a journey into possible oblivion. That was the last time Basil saw him. Weeks later, a camel driver from Siwa claimed he'd spotted a lone figure heading west across the dunes. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried something rolled under his arm. When the driver called out, the man didn't answer. He simply kept walking, straight toward the horizon, until the heat shimmer swallowed him. Whether it was Varley, no one could say, but Basil, on hearing the account, sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he muttered, "The monks are collecting them." It was a strange statement, but those who knew him said he never explained it. Professor Basil Rahman had always assumed that the only thing older than his manuscript collection was the furniture in his office, a set of chairs so uncomfortable they might have been designed to discourage visitors. Yet one morning, as he dug through a stack of neglected folios to find a missing lecture note, he came across something he had forgotten entirely, a set of water-stained sketches, folded and tucked inside the back cover of a book on medieval Syrian architecture. At first glance they seemed like rough travel notes, but as he flattened the papers and looked closer, his hands began to tremble. The sketches were clearly of the Crescent Valley. The crescent-shaped pillars were there, drawn from several angles. So was the circle in the dust mentioned in the account of the last walkers, and in one corner, faint but unmistakable, there was a series of lines and dots forming a pattern, almost like a constellation. Basikilis squinted at it for a long time before realizing what it was. Not stars, but a map. It wasn't a map in the conventional sense. There were no place names, no scale, no compass rose, but the arrangement of dots matched a pattern he recognized from old caravan routes. The lines between them seemed to indicate paths, though one in particular broke away from the rest, winding far into empty space before ending at a small spiral symbol. He had no memory of acquiring these sketches. This was not unusual for Basil. He often bought bundles of papers from traders without checking each page, but the quality of the ink, the style of the lines, and the faint smell of frankincense suggested something important. These sketches were old. Very old. He rushed to compare them with Trent's photographs of the valley. The alignment was uncanny. The spiral at the end of the path, he realized, matched the shape of the carved stone Trent had photographed, the one with the odd shadow. The carving was not just decoration, it was a marker. The implications were unsettling. If the spiral marked a destination, then the carved stone was not merely part of the monastery, it was the monastery's map room. And if that was the case, then somewhere within the ruin, perhaps in a wall recess, perhaps under the floor, There could be an actual physical map. Basil tried to dismiss the idea, but once it lodged in his mind, it refused to leave. Over the next week, he became obsessed. He pulled every record of ancient monastic layouts he could find. Comparing them to known desert structures, he found patterns, a preference for hidden passageways, rooms without apparent doors, and chambers accessible only when sunlight hit a particular spot. The House of 1,000 Doors, as some texts called it, was not metaphorical. The breakthrough came when Basil noticed a peculiar detail in Trent's photos. In one image, taken near sunset, the light struck the wall behind the carved stone in such a way that a small section appeared darker than the rest. Trent had dismissed it as water damage. Basil suspected otherwise. If the monks hid anything, Basil muttered to himself, they'd do it where only the observant could see. He now faced a dilemma. He was too old and too unathletic to trek into the Crescent Valley himself. But he didn't trust the average treasure hunter not to destroy whatever might be there. And after Varley's disappearance, no serious expedition would accept an invitation. Then, unexpectedly, help arrived in the form of Amal Hassan, a young archaeologist with an unfortunate habit of wearing white shirts in the field. Amal had worked with Basil on cataloguing Nabatean inscriptions, and owed him a favor after he'd helped her avoid a very public mistake involving a misidentified camel skeleton. When Basil showed her the sketches, she didn't laugh. Instead, she stared at them for a long time, then at the old photographs. "If this is what I think it is," she said, "the spiral isn't the monastery, it's the gateway." Basil raised an eyebrow. "To what?" "You too." Amal hesitated. "That's the part no one agrees on. But the Bedouin have a saying, follow the spiral, and you leave the world you know." That was all Basil needed to hear. Within a month, Amal had assembled a small, discreet team. They travelled under the pretense of conducting geological surveys, carrying the copied sketches tucked inside a battered field journal. Only Basil and Amal knew their true purpose. The journey was slow and brutal. Sandstorms cut visibility to nothing. Compass readings wavered inexplicably. Once, in the early morning, Amal swore she saw figures on a distant ridge, tall, robed, moving in single file. But when she called to the others, the ridge was empty. When they finally reached the crescent pillars, Amal felt an odd stillness in the air. No wind, no sound of shifting sand, just silence, so complete it seemed to press against her ears. She led the team to the carved stone, and waited until sunset. As the light faded, it happened. The same shadow Basil had spotted in Trent's photo appeared. This time, Amal walked toward it. Her hand traced the wall until she felt a slight change in the texture. She pushed. A section of the wall swung inward, with a sound like a sigh. Inside was a small chamber, cool and dry, its walls covered in faded but intricate paintings. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it, a flat stone slab carved with the same dot and line pattern from Basil's sketches. Only this time, the spiral was deeper, almost inviting the touch of a hand. Amal reached out. Later, she would tell Basil, she wasn't sure if she actually touched it, or if her hand stopped just short. All she knew was that the air shifted, the silence deepened, and for a brief moment she felt herself standing somewhere else, a place of low golden light, where distant chanting echoed like a heartbeat. Then it was gone. They left the chamber untouched, sealing it as they had found it. Amal's final words before they departed were simple. "The monks didn't leave a map for us. They left a map for themselves." It was almost 20 years after the last recorded sighting of the monks, when a man stumbled into the village of Al-Qadir at dusk, his robe in tatters, his beard matted with sand. He was half-starved, his skin cracked from the sun, and his eyes, well, people said his eyes didn't quite look at you, but rather through you, as though searching for something on the other side. The man called himself Anwar ibn Khalid, a pilgrim from Damascus. He claimed he had been travelling to Mecca when a sandstorm forced him far off the caravan route. For days he wandered without a clear sense of direction, following what he described as a stillness that felt like a voice. Anwar's story was simple at first, a tale of survival in the desert. But once the village elders gave him water and bread, and once the warmth returned to his face, the details began to spill out like a dam cracking. He claimed to have found the monastery. Not the ruins everyone knew about, picked clean by treasure hunters and time, but a living monastery, with walls unbroken and lamps burning in the windows. At first the villagers laughed. The place had been abandoned for decades. No one had so much as found a scrap of parchment in its remains. But Anwar insisted. He said the walls were immaculate, the courtyards swept and the gardens blooming as if the desert itself had been tamed. He spoke of hearing chanting in the air, low, resonant and steady, yet the sound had no clear source, as though it was coming from the stone itself. The most unsettling detail came when he described the monks. According to Anwar, they looked exactly as they had in the old paintings and stories, robes of deep indigo, belts of woven cord, and faces hidden beneath hoods. Yet when he tried to approach them, they moved in slow, deliberate steps, never closer, never further, as though maintaining an exact distance no matter how far he walked. He claimed they never spoke a word to him, though he felt, somehow, that they knew everything about him, his thoughts, his sins, his intentions. They were like mirrors that reflect what you are, not what you look like, he said. Anwar stayed near the monastery for 3 nights, camping at a respectful distance. On the second night, he awoke to find a loaf of bread and a clay jug of water beside him. On the third night, the bread was replaced by a scroll, sealed with a symbol he didn't recognize, a serpent biting its own tail, enclosed within a circle of 7 stars. When he opened it, the parchment contained no words, only a diagram. He described it as a map, but not of the desert. It was a map of a place you couldn't walk to, he told the elders. A map of the sky, and something beyond the sky. On the 4th morning, the monastery was gone. He swore that when he awoke, all that remained was sand and rock, as if it had been swallowed whole by the desert in the night. The bread, the water jug, the scroll, all vanished. Only the memory remained. Naturally, the skeptics had their say. Perhaps Anwar was delirious from heat stroke. Perhaps he stumbled upon a caravan camp and mistook it for the monastery. Or perhaps he invented the story for coin or hospitality. After all, a tale of the vanished monks was as good as gold in a village living off the trade of passing travellers. But others were not so quick to dismiss him. His physical state when he arrived was undeniable, a man who had survived something harsh and strange, and there were details in his story that matched much older, fragmented accounts of the monks, the indigo robes, the soundless movement, the strange symbols no one could fully explain. A scholar from the coastal city of Aden happened to be passing through Al-Qadir at the time, and took careful notes of Anwar's testimony. These notes, preserved in a private collection for centuries, later became a key source for modern researchers obsessed with the monk's fate. The scholar wrote, in the margin of his manuscript, "If this man lies, then he lies in the manner of one who has seen something that cannot be spoken plainly." For weeks after his arrival, Anwar became something of a reluctant celebrity. Pilgrims sought him out for blessings, merchants pressed him for more details, and the local imam asked whether he believed the monks were still alive. Anwar's answer was always the same. "They are alive," he would say, "but not as we are alive. They are where they chose to be, a place without hunger, without thirst, without the passage of time. I was not meant to follow them there." Eventually, Anwar left the village as abruptly as he had arrived, heading east toward the mountains. Some say he was searching for the monastery again. Others believe the monks had given him a task, one that required secrecy. He was never seen in Al-Qadir again. To this day, the story of the pilgrim who saw the monks remains one of the most retold parts of the legend. Some storytellers present it as proof that the monks' disappearance was no tragedy, but a conscious retreat to a higher state of being. Others frame it as a cautionary tale, a reminder that some doors, once glimpsed, should remain closed. And perhaps that's the enduring allure of Anwar's account. It sits perfectly between the believable and the impossible. Whether he stumbled upon a mirage, a parallel world, or simply the fevered dream of a man too long in the sun, no one can say. But for those who hear it under the desert stars, with the wind whispering through the dunes, it's easy, dangerously easy to believe. When word of Anwar ibn Khalil's sky map reached the trade cities, it didn't take long for it to fall into the wrong kind of hands, or the right kind, depending on your perspective. In Aden, 2 merchants who dabbled equally in spice and smuggling were among the first to take an interest. They knew the desert could hide treasure. Ancient gold, sacred relics, forgotten manuscripts worth more than caravans of frankincense. And if this map really did lead to the monastery, perhaps the monks had left behind something more valuable than prayers. The trouble was, Anwar had left the village without the scroll. He claimed it had vanished along with the monastery itself. But human greed has a way of bending reality to its will. Within months, several versions of the map began circulating in the bazaars. Each seller swore his copy was drawn from memory by someone who had seen the real thing. Some were clumsy imitations, little more than circles and stars scrawled on papyrus. Others were elaborate forgeries, painted with gold dust and sealed with wax impressions of serpents. Most buyers didn't care about authenticity. They wanted the story and the gamble, and so expeditions began. Some were small affairs, a handful of men with camels, water skins, and more optimism than sense. Others were grand ventures, led by wealthy patrons who hired guards, guides, and astrologers to interpret the celestial markings. What they all had in common was failure. The first group returned after 2 weeks, their lips cracked, their supplies gone, their tempers raw. They swore the map had led them in circles, always back to the same dune. The second group never returned at all. Months later, a Bedouin patrol found their camp abandoned, tents still standing, fire pits still warm, but not a soul in sight. Then came the third attempt, the one people still talk about. It was led by a man named Yusuf al-Harith, a former court astrologer from Baghdad, who had fallen out of favor after predicting a solar eclipse on the wrong day. Desperate to restore his reputation, Yusuf claimed he could read the map in ways others could not. The monastery, he announced to anyone who would listen, is not fixed in one place. It moves. The stars tell you when and where it will appear. To prove his theory, Yusuf set out with a team of 12, including 2 scholars, a scribe, and a caravan of 30 camels carrying water, food, and instruments for measuring the heavens. According to the account of the scribe, the only man to return, they traveled for 11 days without incident. Then, on the 12th night, something changed. The air grew still. The stars, normally brilliant in the desert sky, seemed to fade, as though a thin veil had been drawn over them. The camels refused to move forward, and somewhere, beyond the next rise of sand, the scribe heard chanting, low, deep, and steady, the same detail Anwar had described. Yusuf, convinced they had found the monastery, ordered the men to advance. But when they crested the dune, there was nothing. Only a vast expanse of untouched sand, glowing faintly in the starlight. Still, Yusuf insisted the sound was coming from just ahead and pressed on. The men followed for another hour until the chanting suddenly stopped. That's when the ground began to change. The sand beneath their feet felt oddly firm, almost like stone. The air smelled faintly of incense, though no fire was burning. The scribe swore he saw shadows moving in the distance, tall, robed figures gliding just beyond the range of their lanterns. Panic set in. One of the guides refused to take another step, claiming they had crossed into the monk's shadow world and would not be allowed to leave. Another man muttered prayers under his breath, refusing to look up. Yusuf, undeterred, kept walking until he vanished into the darkness. Yes, vanished. The scribe's account is maddeningly vague here. He insists that one moment Yusuf was in front of him and the next he was gone, not behind a dune, not swallowed by a sandstorm, simply gone, as if the desert had closed over him. The rest of the men turned and fled. By the time they reached the safety of their camp, 2 more were missing. The scribe returned to Arden alone, carrying nothing but the journal in which he had recorded the journey. His account, now preserved in a museum, contains pages of star charts, strange diagrams, and a final note written in a hurried, shaky hand. The map is not a guide, it is an invitation, and some invitations cannot be refused once accepted. After that, no one openly attempted to follow the map again, at least not in public. Rumors persisted of secret expeditions, of wealthy patrons sending lone envoys into the dunes, hoping to slip between the cracks of the visible world and find the monk's hidden sanctuary. But, if any succeeded, they never returned to boast of it. Today, the sky map is a collector's curiosity. You can find reproductions in tourist markets from Morocco to Oman, usually framed with fake gold leaf and sold alongside ancient coins and jars of desert sand from the monk's last path. But among certain circles, historians, mystics, and those with a taste for dangerous quests, the map remains a whisper, a promise, a riddle written in the stars. And perhaps that's the most dangerous part of the story. Not the desert itself, not the monks, not even the possibility that the monastery exists in some other realm. The real danger lies in the human mind, in its stubborn refusal to let go of a mystery. Once you've heard the tale of the sky map, it's hard not to imagine what you might find if you tried to follow it. By the middle of the 18th century, the monks had become less of a historical mystery and more of a fireside story. Merchants told it to amuse caravans on long crossings. Innkeepers wove it into gossip for travelers passing through dusty roadside towns. Scholars wrote thin, speculative treatises, linking the vanished monastery to every lost civilization from Atlantis to the builders of the pyramids. But then came the man from Shiraz. He arrived in the port city of Muscat on a merchant ship from the Gulf. his clothing a patchwork of worn fabrics that didn't quite match any known region. His hair was white, though he claimed to be only 43. He carried no money, no identification, and no baggage except a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When questioned by the harbour guards, he told them, very simply, that he had come from the monks. It should have been dismissed as another madman's claim. The docks attracted plenty. But there was something about the man's manner. Witnesses described his voice as calm, almost hypnotic, and his eyes as the kind that seemed to be looking at the world from a very great distance. He was polite, soft-spoken, and oddly patient, even when people mocked him. The authorities, curious but cautious, allowed him to move freely in the city, provided he checked in daily. Within a week, the story spread. A man who had supposedly walked out of the desert from the direction where the monks' monastery was said to be. And with the story came the inevitable invitations from scholars, mystics, and the sort of wealthy collectors who hoard secrets like they hoard gold. The man never gave his real name. People began calling him the Last Pilgrim. When pressed for details, the Last Pilgrim claimed he had been a trader's assistant years earlier and had wandered too far from his caravan during a sandstorm. Instead of perishing, he said, he had been found by a group of robed men who took him to a place he called the House of Stillness. He described vast courtyards paved in white stone, fountains that flowed without sound, and gardens where the air seemed to shimmer with a constant golden light. He claimed there were no walls around the monastery, only the desert stretching endlessly in every direction, but that no matter how far you walked, you would always return to the same place. The monks, he said, spoke a language he did not recognize, yet he understood them perfectly. The most unsettling part of his story was his account of time. I do not know how long I stayed, he told one Persian historian. I went to sleep many times, but never saw the sun rise or set. When I left, I thought perhaps a season had passed. They told me it had been 20 years. He unwrapped the bundle he carried only once, for a gathering of scholars. Inside was a single object, a narrow staff made of blackened wood, smooth as polished marble, with a band of silver near the top etched with intricate, unfamiliar symbols. He allowed them to examine it, but not to keep it. The staff, he said, had been a gift, proof that I had been there, but also a reminder not to return. The scholars predictably argued. Some said the silver band bore pre-Islamic inscriptions in a script related to Aramaic. Others swore the markings were purely ornamental, designed to mislead. A few believed the entire object to be a recent fabrication, made to sell a good story. What no one could explain was the wood. It was unlike any known species in Arabia, Africa, or Persia. Tests decades later would show it matched no catalogued tree in the world. The Last Pilgrim stayed in Muscat for 6 months. During that time, he never once sought money or luxury. He spoke to anyone who asked, told his story without embellishment, and refused every offer to lead an expedition back into the desert. The way there is not found by maps, he said. It is found when you are ready to be lost. One evening, as suddenly as he had arrived, he was gone. The innkeeper where he stayed said he had paid his small bill in full, left the key on the table, and walked toward the edge of the city at dawn. A fisherman claimed to have seen him boarding a small boat with no oars, drifting into the mist. No one saw him again. The staff, however, resurfaced decades later in the private collection of an Omani merchant family, who claimed it had been given to their grandfather in payment for silence. Today it sits in a locked case in a back room of the National Museum in Muscat, officially labelled only as artifact of unknown origin. As for the Last Pilgrim story, it remains in that grey space where history and myth overlap. Was he a fraud who stumbled on an unidentifiable piece of wood and wove a tale to match? Or was he truly the final outsider to enter the monks' hidden world? In the end, it doesn't matter. The legend of the desert monks had already lived for centuries without proof. His arrival only gave it another chapter, one final, tantalizing suggestion that the monastery still exists, waiting for the right traveller to lose themselves enough to find it. If the Last Pilgrim's tale had merely drifted through taverns and caravan gossip, it might have faded with him, but unfortunately, or perhaps inevitably, it reached the ears of a man who made his living chasing lines on paper, Jean-Baptiste Renoir, a French cartographer with more ego than good sense. Renoir had been mapping trade routes across North Africa for the French crown when the pilgrim story reached him in Cairo. He was the kind of man who could hear a wild rumour, shake his head in mock disbelief, and then spend 3 years of his life and most of his fortune trying to prove it true. In 1768, Renoir declared publicly, in a smoky Cairo coffee house, that he would locate this so-called House of Stillness and reduce it to a proper coordinate on a proper map. He claimed that all myths were merely truths obscured by bad geography. His preparations were obsessive. He studied every available desert chart, consulted with Bedouin elders, and collected every surviving scrap of the monk's legend, including second-hand accounts of the last pilgrim's time in Muscat. He even convinced a scholar to sketch the black staff from memory, noting the patterns of the silver band. Not decoration, Renaud insisted. A map. They gave him a map and he didn't even know it. By spring, Renaud assembled a team of 12 camel drivers, a cook, 2 guides from the Rub al Khali region, and a young astronomer from Alexandria who could navigate by stars. He brought barrels of water, crates of dried food, surveying instruments, and a strange contraption of brass and mirrors he claimed could detect mirages. The first weeks were uneventful. They followed known caravan trails southward, stopping at oasis towns to resupply. Locals humoured him, offering vague directions with the same amused tolerance one reserves for children searching for buried treasure. It was on the 23rd day that things began to shift. The guides reported unusual wind patterns, hot gusts that came without warning, and carried fine red dust unlike the surrounding sand. The astronomer noted that the stars seemed slightly off, as if some were brighter than they should be. Renaud, convinced this meant they were approaching something extraordinary, pushed them harder. They left the main trade routes and entered territory no one in the caravan had crossed before. The land grew eerily featureless. No rocky outcrops, no scattered shrubs, just an endless pale expanse. The trouble started on the 31st day. At dawn they discovered that the tracks of their camels from the previous day had vanished overnight, not covered by wind, simply gone, as if the sand had rearranged itself. That night one of the camel drivers swore he saw lights on the horizon, small steady glows like lanterns. By the time Renaud climbed from his tent, the lights had winked out. 3 days later, the cook wandered away from camp in the morning and didn't return. Search parties found nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of struggle. One of the guides quit on the spot, taking his camel and disappearing in the opposite direction. Still, Renaud pressed on, insisting they were hours away from the monastery. But the more they travelled, the more disoriented they became. The sun seemed to hang too long overhead. Shadows stretched at odd angles, and their compasses began to spin lazily instead of pointing north. The astronomer, keeping his nightly charts, became pale and withdrawn. On the 42nd day he showed Renaud his star maps and pointed out something disturbing. The constellations no longer matched Earth's sky. "We are not where we think we are," he whispered. "Perhaps we are not even when we think we are." Morale collapsed after that. The remaining camel drivers muttered about curses and places that eat men. 2 more left during the night, their absence discovered at dawn. On the 51st day, with supplies dwindling and only 5 men left, Renaud finally admitted defeat. They turned north, aiming to return to known territory. But the desert had one final cruelty in store. After a week of steady travel, they arrived at a small oasis, only to realize it was the exact same one they had passed on their way in. They had been traveling in a circle. By the time they stumbled back into the fringes of civilization, they were barely recognizable, sunburnt, ragged, half-starved. Renaud's brass and mirror contraption had melted into a useless lump under the relentless heat. In Cairo, he told no grand stories. Instead, he sold his remaining instruments, drank heavily, and refused to speak of the expedition. When pressed, he would only say, "We found nothing, but it found us." He died a year later, penniless, with his final map still on his desk, a simple circle in the middle of a blank expanse, and a single note in the margin. "You do not measure the House of Stillness. It measures you." For decades after Renaud's failed expedition, the House of Stillness faded back into its usual state, a rumour you could buy for the price of a drink. But in 1893, an archivist named Eleanor Whitcomb received a letter that changed everything. Whitcomb worked in the dusty back rooms of the British Museum, cataloguing manuscripts that no one cared about. She was not an adventurer. She was not even a believer in all that mystical desert nonsense, as she once described it in a letter to a colleague. But she was meticulous, and she knew her handwriting. The letter was postmarked from Aden, written on yellowed parchment in a style that had been out of fashion for centuries. It was addressed to the Custodian of Records, London, and inside was a single sheet, along with a scrap of cloth embroidered with the same interlocking circles, said to be etched into the black staff of the last pilgrim. The letter read, to the one who keeps accounts of things forgotten. Do not seek us. We are not lost. We have walked beyond the line where shadow becomes light, and where breath is not the measure of life. The house you call stillness is not a place but a turning, and those who arrive do not return because there is nowhere to return to. Your maps end at sand. Ours begin there. We send this so you will know that the silence is not empty. It listens. One who waits in the third court. Whitcomb's first thought was that it was a forgery, some antiquarian prank, but the fabric troubled her. It was hand-woven, not machine-made, and the dye was unlike any she had seen, a deep, almost luminous black that seemed to absorb light. She took it to a textile expert, who dated it at several hundred years old, possibly much older. The embroidery thread, oddly, showed no sign of decay. Then there was the ink. Chemical analysis revealed compounds that did not match any known commercial or natural source, at least not from Earth. One chemist, after staring at the results for a long time, simply muttered, "This shouldn't exist." Whitcomb quietly filed the letter in the unsolved oddities drawer and told no one else. But 2 weeks later she began receiving other mail. Blank envelopes, unpostmarked, left on her desk when no one was looking. Inside each was a single grain of sand. At first she thought it a joke, but each grain was identical, perfectly spherical under a microscope, with a smoothness unlike any natural sand formation. And when she accidentally spilled one into her tea, she swore the liquid shimmered for a moment, like heat on stone. In her private notes, Whitcomb wrote of a dream that came to her repeatedly after the letter arrived. She was walking in the desert under a sky with too many stars, and ahead was a building without walls, only doorways. Each doorway led into darkness, and from within that darkness, she could hear the sound of pages turning. By early 1894, Whitcomb had grown pale and distracted. She began corresponding with obscure scholars in Cairo, Muscat, and Damascus, using coded language that only hinted at her obsession. In one letter, she wrote, "I believe they are still there, but we are the ones who have moved." Her last entry in the museum's staff ledger was dated June 17th. She never returned to work. The landlady at her boarding house reported that Whitcomb left early one morning, dressed for travel, but took no luggage. She was seen walking toward the docks. No ship's manifest records her boarding. A month later, a package arrived at the British Museum. It contained her museum ID card, the original letter from the one who waits in the third court, and a second piece of cloth, this one bearing an embroidered key. There was no note. The fabric is still in the archives today, catalogued under Unverified Correspondence, Middle East. The museum will tell you it's an oddity of no great significance, but the archivists whisper about it, especially those who have handled it. They say the black dye is warmer than the surrounding air. One curator swears that when the lights are off, the embroidery glows faintly, and if you look too long, you can see the outline of a doorway. Whether the House of Stillness is real, or whether it exists only in the fevered imaginations of pilgrims, cartographers, and lost archivists, is still debated. But those who believe will tell you this: the desert doesn't need you to find the house. If it wants you, it will open a door, and when it does, there's no coming back. Not because you are lost, but because you are finally found. And perhaps that's the point. The monks never vanished. They simply walked out of our map and into theirs.